আবার ডাক্তার দেখিয়ে কোনো মতে বড্ড উইক লাগছে।
গলাটাও একটু ক্লান্তই লাগছে।
হ্যাঁ, ঠিক আছে, আমি আছি। হ্যাঁ
ভয়েসটা খুব টায়ার্ড লাগছে।
হ্যাঁ
আচ্ছা, আমি
আমি
কি
আছি।
পানীয়টা দেব?
এই তো
হ্যাঁ
ম্যাম জয়েন করে
শুরু
গেছেন।
হওয়ার আগে
আমি আছি। হ্যাঁ
ভয়েসটা খুব টায়ার্ড লাগছে।
হ্যাঁ
আচ্ছা, আমি
আমি
কি
আছি।
পানীয়টা দেব?
হ্যালো ম্যাম।
গুড ইভিনিং সম্পর্কি।
হ্যালো হ্যালো
গুড ইভিনিং সম্পর্কি। গুড ইভিনিং, গুড ইভিনিং। শুনতে পাচ্ছেন
হ্যাঁ
দিদি? শুনতে পাচ্ছেন?
হ্যাঁ আমি শুনতে পাচ্ছি।
ঠিক আছে, ওকে।
ত্রয়ী
শুরু
এন্ড
হয়ে যাবে।
সঞ্চিতা, দেখো তো, ইজ দিস বেটার? আর নাকি এটা
ম্যাডাম
ছাড়াই
একদম
ঠিক
ঠিক
আছে?
লাগছে। আর
হ্যাঁ, হ্যাঁ,
কথা
ঠিক
বলুন।
আছে? না, এটা
আমারটা
না
শুনে
হলে
যাচ্ছে
আমি
তো?
লাগাবো।
হ্যাঁ শোনা যাচ্ছে। তানিয়া দি
ম্যাডাম,
আরেকবার
শোনা
একটু।
এই আমি কথা বলছি।
আর
আমার
ওটা
মনে
কানে
হচ্ছে
দিয়ে।
গুড ইভিনিং লেডিস এন্ড
মাইক্রোফোনটা দিয়ে,
জেন্টলম্যান।
এটা মাইক্রোফোন দিয়ে মনে হচ্ছে বেটার।
এই একবার
Better.
বললাম,
ইয়ারফোন দিয়ে বেটার।
আবার বলছি, গুড ইভিনিং লেডিস এন্ড জেন্টলম্যান। হুইচ ইজ বেটার?
একই লাগ।
ইয়ারফোন দেবো?
হ্যাঁ ইয়ারফোন দিয়ে মনে হয় একটু
তাহলে
বেটার লাগছে।
করবো না,
ডিস্টিংক্ট সাউন্ড।
কানে ব্যথা লাগে। বেটার লাগছে?
এইটা বেটার লাগছে
জয়েন করে
এটা
গেছে।
বেটার এখন। হ্যাঁ
এটাই থাক।
ম্যাম জয়েন করেছেন। হ্যালো ম্যাম।
ম্যাম জয়েন করেছেন। হ্যালো ম্যাম।
সঞ্চারী।
5টা বাজলো তানিয়া দি, মানে এইখানে 5 শো করছে।
একদম 5টা।
একদম 5টা।
সঞ্চারী দি শুনতে পাচ্ছেন তো? সঞ্চারী দি আপনি শুনতে
রেজিস্ট্রার স্যারও
পাচ্ছেন?
জয়েন করে গেছে।
হ্যাঁ কিছু বলছো?
হ্যাঁ বলছি, শুনতে পাচ্ছেন তো পরিষ্কার?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ
আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে।
ফোনটা আলাদা সরিয়েই দাও, তোমার কাছে থাক। আনো তো, এখানে থাকো, ফেলবো না।
আমরা শুরু করব তানিয়া দি। ওকে।
ঠিক 5টা 1। So let me know when you go live on YouTube.
Yes, it will be live streaming.
So should I begin?
Yes, and the entire program will be recorded. Also.
So let me know when the streaming begins.
Kopil, has the streaming started?
Yes.
Kopil?
হ্যাঁ স্ট্রিমিং হচ্ছে
Yes, the streaming has started.
Okay,
Yes,
okay.
yes.
So we can begin.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a matter of pleasure and pride to welcome all dignitaries, faculty members, and students to the online Rokeya Memorial Lecture that is being held at Diamond Harbour Women's University. This has been organized by the Departments of Bengali, History, and Women's Studies. This is the fourth Rokeya Memorial Lecture and the first that is being held online for a reason that's obvious: the not yet over raging pandemic. Our esteemed speaker in this year's Rokeya Memorial Lecture is Professor Sanchari Ray Mukherjee, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of South Dinajpur University, West Bengal. I'm tempted to draw a parallel between what was happening in the East, especially in British colonial Bengal, and in the West. In the West, also, the years between the 1880s and the 1930s was a period in which women were trying to emerge as citizens equal to men, independent, self-reliant, competent, confident, and assertive. Rokeya Begum's attitude mirrors that of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, especially what she had stated in the Solitude of Self in 1892. Stanton said, I quote, "In discussing the rights of woman, we are to consider, first, what belongs to her as an individual, in a world of her own, the arbiter of her own destiny. Her rights under such circumstances are to use all her faculties for her own safety and happiness. Secondly, if we consider her a citizen, as a member of a great nation, she must have the same rights as well as other members according to the fundamental principles of our government. Thirdly, viewed as a woman, an equal factor in civilization, her rights and duties are still the same: individual happiness and development. Fourthly, it is the incidental relations of life, such as mother, wife, sister, daughter, which may involve some special duties and training." Unquote. Don't we find striking resemblances? Here in Bengal was Rokeya Begum, who was striving to give women opportunities for higher education, for the full development of a woman's physical and mental faculties, for giving her freedom of thought and action. Our speaker, Professor Sanchari Ray Mukherjee, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of South Dinajpur University, will enlighten us about the hardships Begum Rokeya had to face. Born in an educated family, but in a time when it was considered normal that girls would, or rather should, receive an education far less as compared to their brothers. Everyone accepted such discrimination, but she didn't. Begum Rokeya's expansion of aims included not just studying for herself, but also to begin a school for Muslim girls at Bhagalpur, which later shifted to Calcutta, the Shakhawat Memorial Girls' School. And that makes her a pioneer. It is significant that Begum Rokeya chose to write principally in Bengali. She contributed regularly to Mohammadi, Novoprabha, Mohila, Bharat Mohila, Al Islam, Nawaroz, Bangla Musalman Sahitya Potrika, The Musalman, Indian Ladies Magazine, etc., making people aware of women's rights, the need for women's education, social ills like child marriage and polygamy. Motichur is a 2-volume collection of essays on thoughts about women and society. Poddorag is about the oppression of Bengali wives, and Oborod Bashini is a critique of the severe forms of parda for women. As a student of literature, I was much impressed during my postgraduate days reading her piece on feminist utopia, Sultana's Dream. This was written in 1905. Interestingly, it was written a decade before the American novelist Charlotte Perkins Gilman published Herland, also a novella set in Ladyland, also ruled by women. Diamond Harbour Women's University is a first state university in West Bengal for women that was established exclusively for women students. Is it not natural that our university must organize a memorial lecture every year in the name of Begum Rokeya Sakhawat Hussain, writer, literator, educationist, and social reformer, one of the builders of Bengal? Having introduced the theme, it is my honor and pleasure to request Professor Anuradha Mukhopadhyay, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Diamond Harbour Women's University, to kindly deliver her inaugural address. Ma'am.
Ma'am is not audible, I think. Is it so? Ma'am is not audible.
Ma'am, you're not audible. Ma'am, please unmute yourself. Disconnect হয়ে গেলেন তো ম্যাডাম।
হ্যালো ম্যাম, আপনাকে শোনা যাচ্ছিল না, আমরা সবাই বলার চেষ্টা করছিলাম।
Apologies for the technical snag. Madam Vice Chancellor needs to join in again. So we will wait for a minute or two. One of the vagaries.
আচ্ছা এবার শোনা যাচ্ছে? Can you hear me now?
Hi, ma'am. Hi, ma'am.
Okay.
So once again,
Very good evening to all those present in today's lecture. I take this opportunity to welcome you all to the 4th Rokeya Memorial Lecture. Diamond Harbour Women's University has taken the initiative to organize this lecture since 2016. Eminent academicians from the University of Kolkata, Vishwabharati University, Utrecht University have delivered the lectures in previous years. Rokeya Sakwat Hussain is one of the pioneers of women's education and their rights, especially in India. Throughout her life, she has struggled in her own ways for educating women, claiming their rights to live a dignified life, and above all, to set them free from the bonds of orthodoxy and the politics of gender. Her writings have been inspiring generations of women to come forward and create a space of their own. As Swami Vivekananda once said, that just as a bird cannot fly with one wing only, both wings are necessary, so also a nation cannot develop with the education only of its menfolk. The education and the development of its womenfolk are absolutely necessary. From inception till date, our university has been untiring in its attempts not only to educate female students, but also to increase the scope of research for them. In this regard, our vision is what Rokeya Sakwat Hussain also dreamt of. And I think this lecture will address the issues which she raised during her time, and it will open different avenues for our students and scholars to develop their personalities and find out the true essence of life. I welcome Professor Shanchari Rai Mukherjee to our university's webinar for delivering the 4th Rokeya Memorial Lecture. Thank you.
thank you, ma'am, for your very inspiring words. I take pleasure now in inviting Dr. Saidur Rahman, the Registrar, Diamond Harbour Women's University, to please deliver his welcome address. Sir.
Honorable Vice Chancellor Madam, Professor Anuradha Mukhopadhyay, our Chief Guest, Professor Panchari Rai Mukherjee, Vice Chancellor, Dokhin Dinajpur University, our Dean of Students Welfare, Dean of Arts, Head of the Department of Bengali, History and Women's Studies, other teachers, dignitaries, guests, and my dear students. Good afternoon to all of you. First, I would like to convey my gratitude and thanks to the organizers of this program, Rokeya Memorial Lecture. Thanks to each and every one of you for being here with the web lecture today. Rokeya Sakwat Hussain was a Bengali feminist, thinker, writer, social worker, educator, and political activist from British India. She is widely regarded as a pioneer of women's liberation in South Asia. She advocated for men and women to be treated equally as rational beings, noting that the lack of education for women was responsible for their inferior economic condition. Rokeya held education to be the central precondition of women's liberation and empowerment, establishing the first school aimed primarily at Muslim girls in Kolkata. Until her death, she ran the school despite facing hostile criticism and social obstacles. She founded Muslim Women's Association, an organization that fought for women's education and employment. Throughout her life, she worked for upliftment and betterment of the women of the society. I wish the web lecture a grand success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your kind words. I now invite Professor Topon Mondal, the Dean of Arts, Diamond Harbour Women's University, to also welcome and address the audience.
Good evening, everyone. I feel extremely privileged to welcome our speaker, Professor Sanchari Roy Mukherjee, for the 4th Rokeya Memorial Lecture. Our Honorable Vice Chancellor and our Dean Student Welfare, Tania Chakraborty, and our Registrar have already pointed out the significance of this lecture and also what it means to us. So I am not repeating it. I want to add some points. The late 19th and early 20th century brought new changes with some developments in the society. And here I want to specify women's education in colonial Bengal. Orthodoxy and conservatism restrict women's access to education for quite a long time. The politics of gender was also prevalent. Rokeya Shakhawat Hossain acted as an iconoclast by the challenging the patriarchal prejudice society who is implicit and practiced in the discrimination between the sexes. She fought against all sorts of the restriction imposed on women in general and Muslim women in particular. Some of her path-breaking works like Motichur, first and second volume, Padmarag, Avadarbashini, expressed herself, her feelings for the upliftment of women's condition. She wrote Sultana's Dream in English, and all of her works justify the proverb that the pain is mightier than sword. So we are looking forward to Professor Rai Mukherjee's lecture to explore more about Rokeya Shakhawat Hossain. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mondal. Our esteemed speaker for the Rokeya Memorial Lecture today evening is Professor Sanchari Ray Mukherjee, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of South Dinajpur University. Professor Ray Mukherjee will be introduced formally by Assistant Professor and Coordinator, Department of Women's Studies, Diamond Harbour Women's University, Dr. Troy Sinha. So I invite Dr. Sinha, who's heading the department, to please introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor Ray Mukherjee. Troy.
Thank you, Taniyadi, for inviting me. I feel extremely privileged to introduce our speaker, Professor Sanchari Rai Mukherjee. She is currently the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Dokhin Dinajpur University. She has served as a Professor of Economics since 7th March 2007 and Dean, Faculty of Postgraduate Studies in Arts, Commerce and Law, University of North Bengal. She has supervised 18 PhD and 12 MPhil candidates. Her other administrative experiences include member of the Executive Council of North Bengal University, member of the Finance Committee at North Bengal University, coordinator UGC SAP DRS Phase 3, Department of Economics, North Bengal University. She has been an associate director for major research projects conducted at the Department of Economics, North Bengal University, to name a few, like impact of integrated child development services on the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe population in West Bengal, project undertaken for the Department of Women and Child Development, Ministry of Human Resource Development, Government of India, women laborers in the informal sector, a case study of the hills and plains of Darjeeling district, project undertaken for the Indian Council of Social Science Research. She has presented papers and delivered special lectures across the globe. To mention a few are her bilateral research collaboration program under ICSSR ESRC in University of East Anglia, her exchange visitorship to France, attending the symposium at China, the visiting fellowship at Washington, DC, and many more. So without further ado, I would like to request ma'am to deliver the lecture. We are eagerly waiting for that. So over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Troy, for introducing me. A very good evening to all of you and to the listeners and attendees. I must thank from the core of my heart to Diamond Harbour Women's University for inviting me here. And special thanks to Professor Anuradha Mukhopadhyay, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Diamond Harbour Women's University. Thanks to the Registrar, Dr. Saidur Rahman, and to Professor Topon Mondal, the Dean of Arts, who is also a friend of mine, and to Dean of Students' Welfare, Dr. Tania Chakraborty, who made a very, very good introduction to Begum Rokeya. And in fact, I'll be following her lines actually to explain or give this Begum Rokeya Memorial Lecture. I just hope I can do a little justice to it in spite of the busy schedule that I'm keeping to establish this university. I also express my heartiest thanks to Dr. Anindita Ghoshal, Head of the Department of History, and Dr. Sanchita Bose, Head of the Department of Bengali, and to Dr. Troy Sinha, Coordinator of Women's Studies. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this memorial lecture, Begum Rokeya Memorial Lecture. It is indeed an honor for me, because to speak of an Indian feminist activist, and that too of one belonging to the era when emancipation of women was unthinkable for the society at large, and also of colonial Bengal. Born in 1880, Rokeya Sakhawat Hussain paved the way for the future feminist activists in Bengal and India, of course. Her satirical writings, which has been quite widely spoken about, challenged the patriarchal values that were deeply embedded in Bengal's social and cultural structure. Now, in fact, to me, she is a path-breaking or groundbreaking revolutionary feminist writer, educationist, and an activist. Now, through her writings and activism, of course, she was persistent in delivering the merits of education, which most of you have already spoken about, merits of education to empower the Indian women. Her feminist ideology was unique and transgresses all generations. Her vision for Indian women, and especially Bengali Muslim women, were contemporaneous with the feminist movement in America and Europe, which I'll dwell upon in a short while, and something which Tania had already mentioned. Now, with this prologue, let me start the talk with a quote by Simone de Beauvoir, who was born in 1908, a little later than Begum Rokeya. She says, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." Now, this is perhaps true for every woman, and she who realizes this stands up for her own rights, rights that are equal to men's rights. And some others who want to cross the threshold to freedom and to freedom and light, actually, they voice the concerns of other women and try to emancipate them through continuous struggle against the patriarchal order. Such women were very far and few in number in the 18th and 19th century colonial Bengal. Thus, Begum Rokeya can be addressed as the feminist foremother, as Jahan put it in 1988 and has rightly pointed out. Now, born into a very, very orthodox upper class Muslim family, now she soon became aware of the discriminatory practices within the household itself, where the men ruled and women were forbidden to cross the Janana threshold to step into the world of men. Her elder brothers received the best of education, while the two sisters were allowed to learn Arabic just to read the Quran. She never went to school, that means she never had any formal education, but her grit and determination to educate the women led her to establish, which we have already pointed out, led her to establish a school for women named after her very supportive husband as the Sakawat Hussain Memorial Girls High School, which became a girls' high school in 1930s. It stood the test of time and proved to the world that education is the most powerful tool for empowerment. And Begum Rokeya realized this at a very, very young age. Now, going back to the late 19th century, when Begum Rokeya was born and was growing up as a child, deprived of any formal education, we find that women in the Western world were already out in the streets with their demands for equality and justice, signifying that the feminist movement had already taken off in the Western world, specifically in America, North America, and Great Britain. In fact, Mary Wollstonecraft, which all of you must be knowing about, the renowned women's rights activist, was born in London more than a century back to Begum Rokeya in 1759, had already written the famous book, or one can say the treatise, titled, which advocated equality for women, titled A Vindication of Rights of Women, with strictures on political and moral subjects. This is considered to be one of the earliest writings on feminist philosophy, which was originally published in 1792. I'll talk about another feminist whom I really, in fact, Mary Wollstonecraft and Simone de Beauvoir. I really look up to them and their writings. She was a French writer, intellectual, existentialist philosopher, political activist, feminist, and social theorist. Though she did not consider herself a philosopher, she had a significant influence on both feminist existentialism and feminist theory. And she was born in 1908, just a little later than Begum Rokeya. But this period, when Begum Rokeya was born in 1880 and in the formative state, the world of feminists were greatly influenced by these two writer activists, Mary Oldstrom and Simone de Beauvoir. Thus, in the 19th century, the contours of the feminist political movement was already visible. Feminism became an official concept, and the first feminist wave began in 1850 and lasted till 1940. And the women's movement focused on equality in education, labor, and electoral rights. Begum Rokeya's fight for women's emancipation and empowerment actually coincided with this period. That is the first wave. So what was the first wave? The first wave was characterized by the pursuit of legal equal rights for women. The emphasis was not on the right to education and paid work. Later, this shifted to political rights with a focus on women's suffrage, that is, the right to vote. It was from 1890 to 1920, that was in the early 1920s, that when Great Britain and, in fact, Netherlands, the Netherlands gave the women's right to vote and the political, the political right to the women. In fact, this is the highlight of the first feminist wave. And let us talk a little bit for the students regarding feminism. Now, we've been referring so far to a movement called feminist movement and a doctrine called feminism. Now, this word feminism comes from the Latin word femina, which means woman. Now, in the late 19th century, during Rokeya's formative stage actually, feminism became an officially used term. To define feminism, it is the belief in social, economic, and political equality of the sexes. And feminism in the 19th century commenced with the defending of women's rights. Now, although it largely originated in the West, feminism did spread its wings to worldwide actually, and is practiced by institutions committed to activities on behalf of women's rights and interests. And the spread of feminism as a movement, that is feminist movement, affected the lives of all men, women, and children alike. And feminism is one ism that affected the lives of all, irrespective of the presence of all other isms like capitalism, Marxism, socialism, and so on. Thus, feminism is cross-cutting and all-pervasive, irrespective of class, caste, creed, religion, race, color, etc. And this movement of the middle class, first wave feminists in the 19th century accomplished women's right to vote, as alluded to earlier, and also to gain access to education and employment. This women's rights movement and the rejection of the traditional gender roles in the 19th and in the early 20th centuries in the United States, in North America and Great Britain, seem to have percolated to colonial Bengal too. And let me come back to this a little later. Now, if you look at the social history, we find that each generation had its marginalized section of the population who resisted, who revolted, or fought for change. For example, today, we are privy to news stories about the struggle for the gays and the lesbian rights, and they form a part or one section of our society. But about 150 years back, when we are talking about the first movement, first wave, the marginalized section was even a larger segment of the population, and they were the women. Throughout the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, women fought for equal rights under the law, and most importantly, the right to vote. Let us now turn once again to what 19th century societal expectations were towards women. Both in North America and Britain, where the first wave originated, women and men were expected to fill up separate spheres of society. Men were expected to live a public life, whether it was working in a factory or socializing with like-minded people, or men in public areas or public places. Now, this was also the phase when Britain was experiencing the first industrial revolution, with a large section of the population moving away from their farmlands, or rather serfdom, to the cities in search of work in the factories that were newly built factories. And it was then that the gender division of labor got accentuated. Men who earned the wages became the breadwinners, earning wages from factories and plants and feeding the dependents at home, who were the women and the children. So the dependency of women became rooted in this industrial revolution. The women, not finding any place in the factories actually, then were usually expected to live their lives largely homebound, taking care of the cooking, cleaning, and child rearing. And free time for women was not supposed to be spent socializing, but doing other things related to the maintenance of the family, that is from sewing to laundry, etc. And they were relegated to the private sphere. For them, home was where the hearth was and not where the heart was. They were not expected to cross this boundary line. This precipitated the segregation of the public sphere and the private sphere, and the debate still exists, which had very serious fallouts in terms of familial power relationship, or in other words, it reinforced the patriarchal hierarchy with male domination and women's subordination. And Begum Rokeya experienced this too. And her mind wandered to the world where it would be the reverse. Yes, where women would be in the decision making and would rule the house and also the world, also the state. A reflection of which we have already mentioned. We find in her novella in English, that is The Sultana's Dream. Well, our society, even in the 21st century, is far from realizing the equality of the sexes. It still remains a dream, even when women have progressed by leaps and bounds. The implications of the private-public separation were many, starting with the differential, what was I saying? The implications of the private-public separation were many, starting with the differential access to opportunities by men and women. Very few women had the same opportunities to be educated as men. Indeed, educating women was often seen as subversive, and in the case of colonial Bengal, a sacrilege, a sin. In Great Britain, women were so bound to their husbands that under 19th century British common law, they were barely considered as people, as human beings. It is common knowledge in today's world that education is a social variable that acts as a catalyst of social change and social mobility. The struggle and sacrifices of feminist activists like Begum Rokeya in today's world seems to be more pertinent and deserves adulation and respect. In the world where she came from, women were parda nashin. Although she herself practiced parda throughout her life, she found no conflict in her strive to be an equal society, to live in an equal society, where both men and women must realize their fullest potential and be free to choose to live their own life, adopting a particular vocation. But the choice has to be hers. And education was the sole criteria through which these could be achieved. And as I say this, it seems I'm echoing Amartya Sen's capability approach, and that all citizens of the country are entitled to education and health, irrespective of class, caste, and gender. Now, coming back to feminism, it challenges the status quo maintained by the patriarchal society of women's subordinate status through various means. Now, traditional expectation was that women would belong to the private sphere, which I mentioned, and would be denied of all the privileges experienced by the men in the public sphere. Throughout Begum Rokeya's writings and her activities as a social reformer and an educationist, this is the norm that she challenged, so that women could play a conscious role in devising and determining their own future and in formulating their own destiny as human beings. It is with this view that she embarked on her writing career in 1902, establishing a school for Muslim girls in Calcutta in 1911, and founded an association or an NGO for Muslim women, the Anjuman-e-Khawatin-e-Islam in 1916. Now, Begum Rokeya was much ahead of her times. Her writings were explicit about the deplorable status of women in the 19th century Bengal, which is being echoed many times in the writings which we found during the Bengal Renaissance. In fact, Begum Rokeya also prevailed during that period, but it was definitely in the early 19th century. And the chain of subordinate status did not end in acquiring a dependent status in the family and society, but deprived the women of a social status, of property, of economic resources, and of education. It denied her very existence as a human being and throttled her voice. Begum Rokeya realized that it was difficult to fight alone. She realized and understood the importance of women's collective in her crusade against the unlawful society. Thus, it was necessary to make women aware about their rights, and this could be achieved only through education. They could not be left ignorant as the society desired. While most women actually internalized this patriarchal dictum, Begum Rokeya challenged this norm, and that is why she is a feminist activist. Women had the right to be educated. They had equal rights as men. Now, if one looks at the contemporary writers and activists in Bengal then, there is no hesitation in attributing Begum Rokeya, in the words of Roshan Jahan in 1988, as the first and foremost feminist in Bengali Muslim society. In her book on Stri Jatir Obonoti, she expresses her anguish over the fact that women themselves believe that they are slaves to men, and the bangles that they wear are nothing but shackles, which Begum Rokeya could comprehend at a very early age. Time and again, for most of recorded history, only isolated voices spoke out against the inferior status of women. And the most vexing problem, which I've alluded to, and by the even by the feminists throughout the world, is the lack of economic security of women. Tradition and culture subscribe to a patrilineal society, discouraging women's ownership of property and resources. In consequence, women led a life of servitude, a life of misery, and as an adage to the men. This is voiced by Begum Rokeya in her book Riha. She was forthright in her comments against Indian society and Indian men. And in the passage that follows from Bengal Women's Educational Conference, she takes a swipe at all Indian men for their total apathy towards women. I quote, which has been translated into English, "You might be surprised to learn that I have been crying for the lowliest creature in India for the last 22 years. Do you know who that lowliest creature in India is? It is the Indian women. No one has ever experienced any anguish for them. If a dog is hit by a car, we hear an outcry in the Anglo-Indian media. But there is not a single soul in the whole of the subcontinent to mourn for the incarcerated women like us." Written in Poem in 2013. Begum Rokeya raised her voice against religious practices too, that demeaned women and gave them a subservient role to play in their lives. Eliza Binte Ilahi of the Asian Age writes, Rokeya believed that men deliberately refuse women equal opportunities to cultivate their minds with the purpose of sustaining women's dependence on men and further perpetuating women's dependence on their own inferior status. Rokeya used examples of women who earn more than their husbands but still submit to the menfolk at home to point out that the framework of women's subjugation exceeds economic parameters. How true it is. Simultaneously, worldwide, there were calls for change. When Begum Rokeya was writing all this and mentioning all this into the media, where she poured her heart out against the Indian men, there were calls for change throughout the world. Beginning in the 19th century, women's acceptance of these traditional roles began to dissipate. Ignoring the harsh words of the patriarchal society, women began taking on serious roles to promote gender equality. The first formal meeting organized towards addressing gender inequality was in 1948 Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. We are very much aware of this. At Seneca Falls, over 300 men and women met over 3 days to discuss the current state of women according to the US law and strategies to mobilize women across the country and foster serious change. There, the attendees actually drafted the Declaration of Sentiments. Now, this document, which adopted some terminology and terms of praise of the US Constitution, laid out the injustices of the current role of women in society, including their inability to own property, their subjugation to men, and their lack of political access, among others. However, the declaration was found to be too radical in its ideas, but still, it is still considered to be the watershed moment for women's rights. 2 years later, many of these same women organized the first National Women's Rights Convention in Massachusetts. This brought together many of the leading figures of the 19th century women's rights movements, including Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth, and the architect of the Declaration of Sentiments, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whom I think Tanya alluded to, and comparing Begum Rokeya to Lady Stanton. Across the Atlantic Ocean, similar women's rights movements were springing up, decrying the existing social order in England and Europe. In England, for instance, groups of leading women's rights advocates, such as the Langham Place Group, met regularly to discuss women's issues and strategies for drumming up support for women's rights. In Great Britain, women were even more disadvantaged. There was absolutely no access to education beyond basic grade school, and women were not even allowed to inherit property or money from their dead husbands. The situation was no better in British India or colonial Bengal. Begum Rokeya wrote protestingly in Woman's Downfall. Just as the sunlight cannot permeate our bedrooms because of the parda, similarly, the light of knowledge cannot penetrate the chambers of a mind. This is because there are no suitable schools or colleges for girls. Men can study as much as they want, but will the gates of our ambrosia treasury of knowledge ever fully open for us? If a noble-minded liberal person approaches to raise us by the hand, then thousands will create resistance. Again, poem 2013. This prompted her, actually, to open her own school to foster education for girls. However, resistance came from religious bigots who started spreading scandal against her. But this did not deter her from encouraging young girls to attend school and receive education, and in the process empowered themselves. And in Britain, of course, also, feminist activists clamored for equal rights for women, including access to education. Britain in 1875, I think it's 1875, enacted the Compulsory Education Act. Please check later on. Enacted the Compulsory Education Act, where every child from the age of 5 would get free and compulsory education, and sooner accepted education as a fundamental right for all its citizens. Going back to the history of feminism once again, the voices raised by the women in the 19th century and later during the Renaissance period and later during Enlightenment were for liberty, equality, and natural rights for both the sexes. This culminated actually into a political movement in France, Germany, and other European countries, giving rise to abolitionism. Later, it spread to Britain and North America, where women's suffrage became the prime issue, including women's employment and wage rights. It is during this period when Begum Rokeya called out to the women in her writing of the dawn. Wake up, mothers, sisters, daughters. Rise, leave your bed and march forward. Do not sleep anymore. Wake up. The night has ended. Whilst women of the rest of the world have awakened and declared war against all kinds of social injustices, we, the women of Bengal, are still sleeping profoundly on the damp floors of our own homes, where we are being held captives and dying in thousands as victims of consumption. It also shows, her writing also shows that the period where women were really in a very, very deplorable status, having a deplorable status, and were sleeping on the floors and were dying of tuberculosis. Now, this clarion call was for the women of Bengal. She understood that unless and until the collective voices of women were raised against the injustices like this meted towards them, the society can never change. And this is very much in tune with the women's agency that we talk about to extract affirmative action from the state and the community. Her unwavering commitment to educate women gives her the identity of an educationist. We as women owe a lot to her for receiving education, and it has been handed down over through generations. Her indomitable courage to challenge the atrocities meted against women makes her a social activist and is worthy of respect from every woman in Bengal and India then and now. As Roshan Jahan, 1988, comments, every educated woman is a living memorial to this remarkable woman. Sorry. Now, I was thinking of going on to a second wave and third wave, but it is not exactly relevant in today's lecture. So what I would say was that in spite of the feminist movement taking on the world, and in spite of the feminist leadership coming from Begum Rokeya and the like all over the world, why are we still left wondering as to why we have failed to incorporate a gender perspective into most of the national development policies and strategies? Why have we failed to promote inclusive and equitable economic growth? Why is there still a segregation in the labor market? Why do we find a large number of women flocking into the informal sector, earning low wages and without any job security? And why cannot we eliminate the gender-based occupational segregation and gender wage disparities that exist today? Why is still crimes against women so rampant? Why is violence against women cannot be controlled in spite of all the acts that have been enacted by the Indian government? So I leave you with all these imponderables to which we may or may not have all the answers. But I must say that there is a need for many more Begum Rokeyas in our society to achieve gender equality and to have answers to all the questions that we can raise in the 21st century also. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me once again. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. That was an extremely enlightening talk, sweeping references to the inception of feminism, references to Rokeya Begum's life, what she had to face in her lifetime, and obviously how she faced patriarchy. So the struggle of all women is against that formidable force, patriarchy, and you brought that to the forefront so well. So we express our gratitude and thanks to Professor Ray Mukherjee. Memorial lectures as per norms are not followed by the question and answer session, but the talk has indeed raised awareness and has given rise to numerous queries in the mind. And as Madam has pointed out, the first step towards achieving the goal of gender equality would be solidarity. Solidarity between women, and Begum Rokeya is one such activist who not just wielded the power of the pen, but she also paved the way for millions. So the best thing to do as women would be to make the personal, the political, because if voices speak together, the impact is much, much more. So as Kimberly Crenshaw says, drawing from the strength of shared experience, women have experienced that the political demands of millions speak more powerfully than the pleas of a few isolated voices. But of course, we need isolated voices like Begum Rokeya to raise that awareness. So you made us aware of that too. So the talk has stimulated our minds to ponder over Begum Rokeya's achievements and to continue striving to achieve what she left unachieved in her very short lifespan of 52 years. So thank you. I take pleasure now to invite Associate Professor and Head of the Department of Bengali, Diamond Harbour Women's University, Dr. Sanchita Bose, to also sum up the lecture and deliver the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Chakravarti. It is my pleasant duty to thank everyone who made today's lecture a grand success. My heartfelt gratitude goes to today's special guest, Professor Sanchari Roy Mukherjee, the Vice Chancellor, Dakshin Dinajpur University, for her excellent, informative, relevant, and analytical lecture. We have been really enriched. Thank you, ma'am. My sincere gratitude and thanks goes also to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Diamond Harbour Women's University, Professor Anuradha Mukhopadhyay. We would not have been able to arrange the program without her permission and encouragement. I also thank the Registrar, Diamond Harbour Women's University, Dr. Saidur Rahman, who was always with us, like every time. My special thanks and gratitude goes to Professor Papun Mondol, Dean of Arts, Diamond Harbour Women's University. Without his relentless effort and help, today's program would not have been possible. He is indeed a patron of today's lecture. I also thank Dr. Tania Chakravarti, Dean of Students' Welfare, Diamond Harbour Women's University. Not only did she inspire us constantly, but also has been the moderator to the program as well. Thank you, ma'am. A very special thanks goes to Dr. Kopil Ghosh, Department of Geography, and Dr. Dishari Roy, Department of Women's Studies, for the technical support. I take the opportunity to thank Dr. Troy Sinha, Department of Women's Studies, Dr. Moumita Bishas, Department of Women's Studies, and Sri Abhijit Banerjee, Department of Bengali, for being with us every step of the way and helping out continuously in organizing today's program. I thank all the faculty members of Departments of Bengali History and Women's Studies and the other faculty members of rest of the departments and staff of the university for remaining with us throughout the process. Last but not least, I thank our beloved students and all the respected listeners and guests and dignitaries who have attended the 4th Begum Rokeya Memorial Lecture over Google Meet and YouTube. I thank you all and express my gratitude on behalf of the organizers. Before we sign off, I thank Professor Roy Mukherjee once more for the insightful lecture. I wish you all a safe and healthy future.